assume you can hear me. I don't usually have a problem with that. Well, good morning, everyone, or getting close to good afternoon. And I want to have some discussion here, and I think there's a lot of issues that have been raised throughout the panel that we can have a lot to say about. So, I mean, I wanted to maybe speak a little bit about the I guess, quote-unquote Black Lives Matter movement. It's funny how movements get named like that, you know, but since it's not like Vietnam, anti-Vietnam War movement, there wasn't an obvious answer. But I want to speak a little bit to why I think actually that did stick with a lot of people and resonate. And that's where I was going to start, but maybe I want to start somewhere a little bit different. I have to say, you sparked something in me, Jared, because I was having this conversation with someone the other day about the direction of the movement, which I think is certainly very relevant. It's something that I think people in a lot of different cities all across the country right now are wrestling with. People who've been engaged is what is the, you know, sort of what is the next step? What is there? What can we do? I mean, it's funny in the age of social media, as positive as social media is and the things that it can do that I think are fantastic, there's a certain, everything is rapid, everything is instant, everything has to happen right away. And so a lot of conversations I have with people are, you know, well, how come what we did didn't work? And I was like, well, it's only been 8 months. I mean, how do, I mean, like, and also not only that, how do you even define worked, right? I mean, I think a lot of what we can misunderstand is the context of what we do. And so I was thinking about that, the Nkrumah quote, the seek ye first the political kingdom and all else will come unto you. And I think that's actually a powerful idea and a powerful thought, because so often we say, well, it didn't work. We weren't able to actually control the police or get community control over the police, however that's defined. That's a very loosely defined term in a lot of ways. And I would say it's not that surprising. Because when you look at where we are in this system, this capitalist system, there's the struggle, and basically, there's a struggle for reforms and the struggle for revolution. The two aren't necessarily counterposed, but if you're going to reform this system, the reality of the situation is that there has to be a broader context that makes those who control the system feel the need to make a concession. And certainly, you know, that's the context of the civil rights movement in particular within the Cold War framework. Certainly this has been, you know, brought out by a number of different scholars, is the role of the embarrassment isn't really the word, but the discrediting of the rhetoric of the United States, the so-called free world, with this Jim Crow system and the manifestations of brutality that were coming out because of what was happening, was key to the thinking of those in the leadership positions about why they felt they needed to make a concession. And we could go on and talk about a lot of different people. But when we were talking about the police, and I found an interesting article thinking about D.C. Ferguson, I found an article from the 30s actually, in D.C. of people fighting against police brutality. Same context, same issues. I mean, honestly, you could just change the dates, turn them from black and white to color pictures, and change the clothes people are wearing, and literally it could be the exact same thing. Because the role of the police is not the same as, okay, well, I'm fighting for a $15 an hour minimum wage. Now, whatever they say, whatever the businesses say, most of them can afford it. And they're going to lie about it and say, oh, we can't afford it. But at the end of the day, they can. So when the struggle reaches a certain fever pitch, when the context is such that it starts to impact their activities, they're able to make that concession. But the police have a role that is much more integral to capitalist society. And I think that, Carla, you brought this up, and maybe the first sentence of what you were saying, the minions sent to kill black and brown people, I like that. But it speaks to the essential role of the police, and this is the point I make in my book, as an element of social control. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but the reality of it is this. You know, what is the only reason a homeless person can't go into an empty house or a hotel room and sleep there? The cops. And we could go down a whole long list of things where this is the case. And people try to, you know, take you away from the basic element and say, well, don't the police do this? Shouldn't you not be able to do that? But at the end of the day, what is their core responsibility? And that is to really enforce the laws of the capitalist state, which at the end of the day are rooted in and biased towards people with money and people with property. I mean, it's that real. If you don't believe me, then ask a question in the discussion, and we'll get into it. I'm sure other people will have good explanations of that. So when you recognize that, you have to recognize that the context of reform, it exists to a certain extent, but a very limited extent, right? Like they'll say, oh, well, you know, we're going to give you a review board, but it's not really going to have any power. Or, well, you know, maybe we'll have some cameras, or this, that, and the third. I mean, even calling them cosmetic, I think, isn't even fair because they aren't very significant at all. I mean, you know, you can have cosmetic surgery and it can be very significant, you know, so these aren't even cosmetic reforms. I mean, these are really just attempts to trick you and to mollify you. But at the core, when you start to raise these questions, I mean, you talk about community control of the police. You know, I mean, just think about that. I mean, if you ask the vast majority of people on the street, and I said, just to go back to the homelessness example, let's say this building across the street here has 5 empty apartments. And I would just went up to any random person and said, there are 5 empty apartments over there. They've been empty for 6 months. They're going to be empty for another year. And I have 5 homeless families that could live in there. Don't you think that they should just be able to go in there? Most people would say yes. And if you said, well, should the police be able to harass people the way they do in oppressed communities, brutalize people, all of these different things, most people would say, well, that's not really that good. So the things that are core to the role of the police that they play, the key activities that they need to carry out, and the way that they carry them out, with guns, with aggression, with violence, if you started to subject that to the community control of average, everyday people, even some people who might not even be affected, who might just be like, ooh, that's not good, then at the end of the day, the ability for the police to do what they do starts to be this alien force that has this power over all people and this fear that they instill in you. Because what is the real reason that you follow the law? At the end of the day, you don't want to get shot or go to prison. There's no other reason. There's no other reason why you follow it. I mean, in a general sense, yeah, you're not going to do some things because you're a decent person. But at the end of the day, like in LA, for example, if you've ever been to LA, they are super aggressive about jaywalking there. So you will be on a corner with no cars for anywhere around, and like 5 people will just be standing on the corner, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to go across, because why? Because they don't want to get accosted by the police. And so at the end of the day, if you start to give people control over that authority, it starts to erode their ability to do the things they want to do, particularly the intimidation factor. So the reform issue is, it puts you in a tough bind. And that's why so many police brutality struggles, they flame up and they go down, because people say, I want justice. I want control over the police and their activities, and when it can't happen, because they can't really let it happen, then it's like, oh, well, we didn't succeed. But when you have the correct context, you can start to redefine what your goals are and what they should be. And that's why I make the point, the Nkrumah quote, seek ye first the political kingdom, because it raises the key question in a police brutality struggle and in a Black Lives Matter movement is, it's not really a struggle for reform of the police, but it's a struggle for power. Because by raising this issue of the fact that these forces, who you know are sort of alien to your community and you do not control, should then be subjected to your control. But the only way for that to happen is to change the power relations whereby this force will be something that you can deal with. And so it means thinking very strategically, very deeply, and in a very rooted way about who controls this system, why do they need the police to do what they want to do, and ultimately, if we want something different, we have to remove those people who won't reform this institution that is serving an important role for them. So it's key, it's a struggle for power. At the end of the day, it's a struggle for power, which in and of itself raises a lot of very, I think, interesting questions related to the whole society. I mean, once you start thinking like, okay, we got to get rid of the old people and put in new people, then it's like, well, how are we going to organize it? What are we going to do? Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to do this? And it starts to really raise the questions that you need to be thinking, and the consciousness you need to have to be serious about thinking about revolution. Anyone can go out and say, oh, we need a revolution. But to really start thinking seriously about what it means to organize the society, which is why I think you're exactly right. So what happens when you win? Which is what Kwame Ture used to always say, right, is that socialism is an economic system. So the question is how do you think that the economy should be organized? Should it be organized in a capitalist way? Should it be organized in a socialist way? So should it be organized for profit or for people's needs? That's the real question at the end of the day. And I think that that is what this movement potentially gives us the ability to raise, but we have to have that level of consciousness and that level of context so that people don't say, oh, we haven't succeeded. Because to some degree, you know, you can define success in a lot of different ways. And if we understand that we're not going to necessarily reform, then we have to say, well, what are we doing? Are we building institutions? Are we building consciousness? How do we do these things? Are we connecting struggles? Because, and to circle back to what I was saying before, I don't even really think the reason Black Lives Matter caught on really had nothing to do with police brutality. People have been killed many, many, many times by the police. It's happened on camera. And not just recently, for years and years and years. There have been big uprisings before. People sometimes forget that, but the days of outrage in New York in the late 80s, what happened again in New York with Anthony Baez, I mean, you know, big uprisings of people that took place. Someone was telling me something about having New York City shut down for like 112 days in the late, I think Dream Hampton was saying that, or doing shutdown demonstrations. So, I mean, it's not that issue. I think what it really is that for Barack Obama to become president, there was really, you know, what's known as a Faustian bargain, right? A deal with the devil, whereby you could have a black president, but you couldn't be too black. And the whole premise of him becoming president was to deny his blackness. There are so many presidents previously who had some far right-wing pastor who said a bunch of crazy, untrue, bigoted things, and they never have to denounce them. But Barack Obama's minister says something that is true. And he has to go way out of his way to just disavow himself from that and from any manifestation of, like, I mean, like, yes, I'm black, but I'm not attached to any of that black stuff, which is why, I don't know, a lot of people didn't like that New Yorker cover right after he won, where it was like him and Michelle in the Oval Office dressed like Black Panthers, and he was dressed like Osama bin Laden. I like that because that was exactly what they were saying, or trying to tar him with, that he had to run from. Oh, well, I'm not one of these black, radical, Muslim, whatever, like, I'm not what you think I am. So essentially, what that meant, and especially in the first term, is that no quote-unquote black issue should come up. I mean, remember with the unemployment? Oh, well, how come you haven't double unemployment? I'm not the president of black America, I'm the president of the United States of America. And now I can't just do things for one group, I have to do things for all groups. Which doesn't really make any sense, because if people are disproportionately affected by even the same problem, then you can't approach it with a general solution. You have to approach it with a particular solution if you want to solve it. So it wasn't about, oh, well, I don't want to just help black people, I want to help everybody. Well, of course, everybody wants to help everybody who's struggling, who's really a person of conscience. But it was about saying, oh, well, I'm not going to value blackness over Americanness. And so you had almost 2 full terms now that are, you know, and I guess really until this moment, where you couldn't really bring it up. But now, I think the time was right at the end of last year. Like, okay, Obama's been reelected, he's on his way out. We know basically nothing major is gonna happen except maybe like a couple free trade deals. So there's not really, there is no, because in the first term, and I just wanna go back to this too, because some of us, we were critical from day one. The first time I ever met Jared Ball, we were at an event where there was a lot of us talking about third-party alternatives in 2008. But for a lot of people criticizing the president, it wasn't that they weren't upset about the things he was doing, but if you looked at the opposition to him, the big opposition, it was just these Tea Party racists. And so there were a lot of people who were like, well, I don't really like that, but do I really want to come out and criticize him? Because then am I feeding into that racist attack? And whether or not that was right or wrong, I think that was a real, palpable fear. And I think there was a lot of people who felt, well, we don't want the first black president to fail. So we don't want to do something that's going to cause him to lose in 2012, because then it'll be like, oh, you have a black president, he was in there for one term, he didn't do anything, which shows we shouldn't give y'all anything, and we're never going to give you another chance. But now all of that is past. And I think you just saw a lot of people who were just like, really, again, you're going to kill someone again, and you're going to do it the way you did it, and then you're going to let them off, and we've not really been able to say anything for like 9 years. Well, now we're going to say something. And I think what you saw wasn't really a response to police brutality, but an uprising against racism. A bunch of people who were like, and that's what you've seen in this movement from the beginning, which is why, for example, the Assata Shakur quote has become big, and her name has become big, because people are thinking systemically. They're looking at it and saying, it's not just police brutality. You have to look at all the other issues. It's the housing, it's the jobs, it's the healthcare, it's the differential in wages. I mean, there's unbelievable amounts of ideological confusion, but it's interesting because it's a little different than a lot of movements where the ideological confusion is like, should I be like a liberal Democrat, or should I be a little more radical than that? I don't know. It's more like, this whole system is messed up, it's all racist, we gotta do something, and I don't know what it is. But at the end of the day, I think that is really what it was about. And that's why I think Black Lives Matter had so much permanence, to finish that thought, or caught on so quickly, because that was essentially the essence of what people are saying, is we are human beings, and we're tired of you denying the fact that we are human beings, so we're gonna, remind you of that. So, be that as it may, I think in the situation where we are now, when we, know these two things. Where you go from here, I think, well, I don't know. I mean, I can't say 100% what the right thing is to do in all situations. But what I can say is I think that at the end of the day, we have to connect these two elements. That people were rising up against what they recognize as a systemic racism. And that when you're dealing with a systemic problem, it's a struggle for power. And you have to connect those two realities. So you're struggling for power to replace one system with another that is more functional. And that's, I think, what it really means to say that you're struggling for socialism, is we're sort of bound up in all these different oppressions, and sort of the one sort of unifying factor in some senses is that it's generally the same people who are maintaining this system. And whatever you're talking about, it's at the end of the day, in the final analysis, it's those people you're going to have to remove, and finding some way to work together, which is not always perfect. You know, Gerald Horne, the historian, says sometimes when you're looking for allies, Sean and I, we were just at this talk, so, you know, but it's fresh in my mind. Sometimes you're looking for the cleanest dirty shirt. And he was talking about the African slaves running away from South Carolina to Florida and linking up with the Spanish, getting armed and going back and raiding South Carolina and taking it to their former slave masters. But then he pointed out, but Spain was one of the most brutal colonial powers, you know? As Sukarno in Indonesia, the great Indonesian leader and nationalist in World War II, was attached with the Japanese, as was Suharto Boshi from India, one of the greatest Indian liberation leaders. So sometimes when you're looking for allies, it's not always clean and it's not always, you know, perfect or seamless. But at the end of the day, if you know you need allies to succeed, you got to find a way to find them. And I think the key is to find, well, is there any unifying factor? I think we have at least one unifying factor. I think there may be more, but at least one, which is that it is the, you know, imperialist ruling class that perpetuates this racist, oligarchic, patriarchal system day in, day out, and that unified enemy creates some basis for unity and for discussion. And I have to say, I think that often is one of the key areas of ideological confusion, is the cleanest dirty shirt thing, because a lot of the focus, I think, is oftentimes on cannibalizing ourselves more than anything else. And I think that that's just something, I don't want to get too deep into that, but I also think that when we're having this discussion of allies, it's important to recognize that it should be a constructive discussion. You know, it shouldn't be a negative discussion. You should be looking for a higher level of unity, not to just guilt trip someone or anger someone or, you know, make yourself feel better by doing something cathartic. So that's kind of an aside about the way we conduct our struggle, but I think it's important. So, you know, moving forward here today, I think there will be a lot of things that we'll hear, a lot of different things that we'll talk about. Hopefully we can get all into this, but I guess if there's really one takeaway for me, is that historically in this country, and, you know, absolutely, the national question is primary. Because the national question, and this is how I put it, the national question is a class question in a way, right? Because I always say, the part of the problem that we have is when we think more abstract than concrete, but capitalism in America, let's just say, imperialism, is constructed in the here and now, or in that particular time, not just in the ether, right? And so there would actually be no significant capitalism or imperialism in America or Western Europe if it wouldn't have been for the use of slave labor. And it was the need to yoke this labor force to this system that developed a whole range of, you know, differing levels of national oppression even, and created an oppressed nation of black people in this country and around the world, and certainly the colonization of the African continent. So certainly, you know, the national question is absolutely primary, because, and I raise that because it speaks to the historical experience of progressive movements in America, which in almost all cases, when they are more successful, it's sort of like the small wheel moving the big wheel. When the black liberation movement starts to move, it moves many other things, many different pieces, because it really is the primary contradiction in American society. The primary contradiction is that you brought millions of black people here to be slaves, to undergird an economic system, then you transferred them over to sharecropping, to undergird basically the same system in a different guise. And then you decided you wanted to do something totally different in the way you organized the economy, but then you didn't really have a plan for what you were going to do for these people. I mean, they say, oh, the Great Migration, they went to get jobs. There was no one-to-one, I'm leaving Mississippi, going to Chicago, and getting a job. That's why you can look back, as I did doing the research in my book, in the 20s and the 30s, in the early 19-teens, and see what are the complaints about black communities. Du Bois raises this in the Philadelphia Negro. It's the slum conditions. It's the racism of the police. It's the lack of jobs. It's the same thing, because these people were expelled from one system into the broader capitalist economy that didn't make any particular place for them. You found places, the service sector, the lowest part of the factories, but still there is no differential thing. So the key contradiction in American society is that, which is why I think for sure you see it in the 60s, the Civil War. Really, it's the struggle of black people in America that drives almost everything else, which is why there is so much fear. That's why Barack Obama had to say, oh, I'm not one of them. Because the implications that raises are so significant for the ruling elite that you must rule out from day one, if you're going to be the president of this system, that you have any connection to the historical black liberation movement, because that is a specter, if you will, to call on Marx, hanging over the American ruling class. It has been since the slave revolts. It continues to be today, and that's why we have to be very serious about making sure our movements are strong and safe and secure, because certainly the more successful we are, the more they'll come. So I will end there so we can have a little discussion, but thank you everyone for coming, and I'm just looking forward to the rest of the day.